Thank you guys for the opportunity today to speak about this very exciting topic, I would say. I'm not a super formalist, but we'll go through some of the slides that I prepared to kind of help guide the conversation, and then I'll be more than happy to answer any of the questions that you guys might have.
Yes. We can hear you just fine.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to try and put my slides on. You can see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. And thank you for the really kind introduction. I just had a little summary slide on that to make sure. I think it's always important to understand who's delivering the information and what their background might be, so that you can understand, what the substance is behind that and how well informed they may be. I'm a chemist, so I deal with the molecules, looked at a lot of different formulations, and in 2010 we entered the cannabis space. Before that, I worked in pharmaceutical drug discovery, drug design, and also fine chemical manufacturing, making lots of different molecules and investigating generic drug manufacturing processes as well. So understanding which molecules are physiologically active, delivering them to the body in important fashions, capturing them and utilizing them in efficient manners, that's a lot of my background and what I've been trained in. And as I mentioned, in 2010, we started cannabis testing. So we were here in Los Angeles, California, and began looking at the supply chain, the very unregulated supply chain in and across California. And in 2011, we were the first commercial lab to start testing for terpenes, something that took a little while to catch on. A lot of people didn't know what the word meant, nor did they understand it would be important to cannabis. Fast forward to today, I think we understand a lot more that they are very important to the holistic and physiological effects, what we often call the entourage or ensemble effects. So again, looking at the right molecules that the plant has to offer, it was very important to say, how can they be delivered to patients to provide this great physiological benefit? We know single molecules like Marinol, single molecules, just CBD by itself, are not nearly as effective as when you bring all of the rest of the molecules of interest from cannabis, other cannabinoids, and terpenes predominantly to drive those physiological effects. So we've been looking at those for a while, and our testing perspective, our formulation and manufacturing perspective has helped me be invited to lecture at places like Health Canada in terms of formulating their regulations and helping them understand the cannabis supply chain, what might be important to test for and when, and who should be responsible for that and the best ways to do it. I've had senators from Pennsylvania and Oregon ask me to give presentations to Senate committee hearings to inform them about making medical cannabis laws or improving the regulations and legislation inside of their cannabis programs. My group and I have published 5 peer-reviewed publications in terms of what are we inhaling, if there are pesticides present in the products, how might that go into the vapor streams, what are the names and the compositions of all of the products that you see, from flowers to concentrates to other derivatives. Are edibles properly labeled? We did a collaboration with Johns Hopkins researchers for that one, and even were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association for that. We've been particularly focused on vaping and vape hardware and those products since around 2013. So I think there was a rise in popularity in the cannabis space around then, and we recognized that this could be a fabulous delivery platform for patients, because you should, in theory, be able to standardize the compositions, be able to offer them in a manner that is not as hot as combustion, and in a fashion that would actually offer a lot of benefits, because it would still be consumed via inhalation, and those molecules more directly enter the bloodstream. So we can compare and contrast such things as combusting cigarettes and vaping nicotine e-juice, as well as combusting cannabis plant material and vaping cannabis plant material or vaping cannabis formulated e-juice products. And I think as chemists, we recognize this could really be a boon for medical patients. And in terms of that focus, we thought, how do we standardize compositions? How do we really take great care of what's going on in there? And how do we pay attention to the molecules that are present so that they can be delivered in a fashion that's acceptable for patients and really acceptable for impactful physiological use without causing harm? So it's been something we've been a part of. We've been formulating and preparing compositions for well over 10 million different vape products to date. And it's something that we haven't seen an adverse event ourselves. And the recent concerns with all the vaping has certainly, really alarmed us as well as many others. And that's why we're taking great care to kind of understand what may be going on. So I thought a good place to start might be, what are we learning collectively? What is the CDC really putting out, and how do we understand their perspective, their information, and what we should learn from that? So before we ever argue, we should first define our terms and really understand what we're talking about. They've kind of changed the name a little bit about what is vape illness. They're now going with EVALI instead of just vapey. To include e-cigarettes, meaning nicotine products predominantly, vaping of any type, and those are devices, and or dabbing, associated lung illness. So I think that's the terms that they're going to proceed with for now. It will hopefully help us all settle down, and at least with the news and everyone else should be calling it. And the way that they're defining that are the symptoms that are listed here. So do you have cough, shortness of breath, or chest pain? Is there any associated nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, or diarrhea with that? And do you have fever, chills, or any weight loss? And when you first see this, you might think it sounds like the flu. It kind of has a lot of very similar characteristics to that. And we are concerned that they may start, reporting these cases in flu season, if that's actually the case. But there are more conditions that go with that. You have to say that there's no associated infection. There's no other types of points of interest that would say it is more like the flu or some sort of cold or cough or something that dissipates rather quickly. So one thing I think is, how fast does it onset? What they're saying mostly is patients have seen their symptoms develop more over a few days, while others have said it's taken quite a while. I know there was a recent case that someone said it was very rapid, very acute. And it turns out that that was a synthetic cannabinoid that was driving that response. It wasn't any, it was a CBD product as labeled, but the actual components of it were synthetic cannabinoids and not cannabinoids that were derived from the plant in any way. And those things have very different physiological effects, unfortunately. So I think it's important to also note that the CDC has now said we have a definition, and we can start to go back and look at the cases and understand who might fit that definition and what number of cases we actually have. So they publish their data every Friday, so it's current as of the past Thursday. And I pulled this data recently, and it said that there were 1,479, cases that are probable or presumed to be of this type. Some may change, there might be more, but they've, gone back and looked at that data as well. So now that we know the definition, if there was an unsolved case or a mystery where it might have looked like the flu, but it wasn't, and then they can go back and say, do I have samples? Can I look at the lungs in different ways? What else might be, present that I can then define it as one of these cases? That can actually happen too. And I think that's important to note, that as the news broke and as some of these cases started coming to light, what we understood was, like, what I first thought was, holy cow, did 1,000 people just show up to the hospital like last week and present with this? And actually, no, they haven't. Some of these cases were being reported because they were cases from the past that actually were then classified as this. So some of the numbers may have, been a little bit inflated. Is it still rising? I think we'll only know over the next couple of weeks. Was it bad batches? Was it contaminants that are now no longer present in the supply chains? And I'll go through a little bit more how it's, highly the illicit market that's providing these things. It could be bad hardware. It could be other things that were an isolated aspect of some geographic regions. And now we're kind of capturing them all as one. And I think it really is important to say, are we going to see 200, 300, 500 cases every week showing up like this? Vaping has been around in the nicotine space since 2007, when the devices were first invented. What we estimate based on some current polls are there are 17.5 million vape users in the US for the nicotine and cannabis combined. 1,500 of those represents a very, very tiny percentage of those users. I think it remains only to be seen, is this going to get worse or be more concerning over time? But we have had a large amount of vaping experience to date. We've also been vaping cannabis for probably closer to 30 years, plant forms predominantly, but also oil and other derivatives. So when we hear the news and people saying, let's demonize THC, people have been inhaling THC for quite some time, and I don't think that's the chemical of interest that is causing concern. So I thought it would be good to handle some of that perspective and start to look at the data a little bit better and understand how it's being generated. It is pretty broad-based. What's probably most interesting is it's not in Alaska, and you can think, well, is that really, no one travels there much, or it's very difficult to get illicit supply chains up there. And it's not a very big market. Hawaii may be slightly different. People will travel there, and there might be more people taking the products there, but not, illicit supply chains from California are probably not that interested in tapping into Alaska, and Alaska has a fully legal regulated system. I just thought that was kind of an interesting one to note too. What we do know is it could be only one use, and you might have this, but it can also be any time in the last 90 days. That's the other parts of those definitions. And as I described, are there any other infections or other reasons to think someone had a heart attack and had those symptoms, as to how they classified the actual illness? 70% of the cases so far that are being reported, they're males. And I think the statistics of who's using these things, it's a younger demographic, right? So 15% are under 18, which is alarming, period, because they're not supposed to access nicotine or cannabis products. And 21% of them are 18 to 20 years old, with the rest of the stats, 18% being 21 to 24. So there is a considerable portion of these patients that are much, much younger. And even not even allowed to access legal regulated cannabis. You're not allowed to access stores unless they're over 21, unless it's an extreme medical case that some of them may be doing that. But I haven't heard of anyone being a younger patient. It's alarming to me that someone as young as 13 is reported with one of these cases. And I think that speaks a lot to a lack of education and a lack of proper information, in addition to regulation, about, are there potential risks with these devices and utilizing this form of ingestion? Absolutely there is. There's no such thing as no risk. I think it's how much risk, when do I take it, why am I absorbing that risk, and is it really necessary, and how do I mitigate those risks with my choices? And hopefully I can describe a little bit more of some of those today. So what we also know from these things, they've studied, a large number of them actually had samples. About 850 of them have been able to provide vape samples. Now, I think what's important is that's the last vape sample they had in their hand when they presented to the hospital. It might not have been the exact same batch from the last 2 or 3 months that have helped cause the actual illness present itself. And that's really difficult then to chase down what might be causing the problem. If it's not something that happens right away, I can't easily point to, it was that in your hand that's causing the problem. It may be building up over time, and then you're only saying this was the last thing I had in my hand, but that might have been, you bought that one 2 days ago, and you weren't using that for the last 2 or 3 months. So that makes it a little more challenging to kind of chase down the chemical ghost, if you will, and figure out exactly what's causing the problem. 78% of the cases, though, are reporting THC use. 31% of them exclusively using THC-based products or cannabis products. Only 10% of them are saying it's nicotine only. So I think that's also important. I can't say cannabis is all the problem here. There are cases of only nicotine users. And I think there's a lot of combinations of nicotine and cannabis. And I'll describe why I think that seems to be an important element for some of what we might want to track down. Very different sets of molecules are used in nicotine vape as opposed to cannabis vapes, but there are also some similarities and overlaps in some cases too. And I, as a cannabis proponent, see it's a little bit disheartening to say the news is trying to demonize cannabis. I think there are even lawmakers and regulators that say, let's go ahead and say no cannabis anymore, and trying to champion that message. We've all fought long and hard to say it's everyone's right to have this first as a medicine, and then we can talk more about adult use. But I think when you see there are some cases of this that are specifically nicotine only, we need to look broader at what's going on with the hardware and the chemicals being used, and it's not only a cannabis problem. So these are the latest CDC recommendations. I copied them right from the website just a few minutes before the presentation this evening. And what they say is kind of interesting. You know, if you are using electronic cigarettes in a nicotine sense to not smoke or combusted nicotine tobacco products, please don't change. Like, continue to use your vaping device and monitor your use, and very carefully watch for any of these types of symptoms. Of course, the general message of it's not a good idea to go ahead and smoke, inhale, or combust anything, you know, is still the CDC's position, and that's a very intelligent and sensible one. But I think it's also interesting that they're not saying completely stop use, meaning don't ban everything. So when we hear of states and regulators or lawmakers saying, let's ban something, I think it's a call for how do we regulate this better, but eliminating certain things may not be in the best interest of everybody. And I think if you see this as a potential illicit market problem, well, telling things that the regulated responsible users can't provide or provide access to under legal constructs will only infuriate the illicit market and really make that a much more difficult problem to control. I'm not a fan of banning things. I think it doesn't really lead to proper control and controlled access, saying here's a good way to regulate them and watch what's going in them. And it is important to note that we don't see these same types of problems in other countries like the UK. What the UK has done is very different in terms of control and regulation, and I think that's probably a major reason why they aren't seeing the same problems we have. So as I mentioned, we've been inhaling cannabis for quite some time, and whether it be combustion or inhalation via vaporization. So there are devices like the Volcano or the Vapor Brothers device, or other handheld devices like the Pax or Da Vinci's that, you know, warm the air in and around cannabis and provide the molecules presented by cannabis for inhalation. And we haven't seen any of those users really purport with these types of, you know, lung illnesses. I think it's also important to note that the rise in concentrated cannabis has definitely become more of a factor with regulation and legalizations, as you see supply chains move around with large excess of plant material that becomes very, very cost effective, very cheap. You see more people doing extractions and formalized setups at scale, so you can start to offer concentrates and extracts to the market across the board in different fashions, different compositions, and also at different costs. So there has definitely been a rise in popularity of inhaling concentrated cannabis since we've seen the laws and regulations changing, and even for handheld devices that have come about in that fashion as well. Dabbing predominantly, where it's larger amounts of cannabis. And I'd say that was something that the CDC kind of included a little bit later, not as the news initially broke, but they said, let's include the use of dabbing as something under these cases, because in consuming large amounts of fats, waxes, they could be driving the lipid pneumonia aspects. And there are other chemical composition concerns that we need to take into consideration when we're talking about how might this illness present itself. I think new usage forms of cannabis, you know, if you hear someone say, well, we've been inhaling cannabis for 30 years, like, but we haven't been always inhaling it like this. So we have a much more limited time frame of understanding of, are these types of inhalation uses, or these forms of the products, are the amounts that people are dabbing, are the rates and types of consumption the same as they were 10, 20, 30 years ago? I think we can all agree, no, they're very different now. So we have a much more limited time frame of use of this type. So I think when people say, hey, we've inhaled cannabis for so long, it's not a problem, I don't know if that's fully genuine. Like, it hasn't been much of a problem. These types of things we haven't seen only until now. But we should be careful and watch them to make sure it doesn't get out of control and become a bigger problem. But I do think it's probably safe enough to say people have been inhaling THC and CBD themselves, so I don't think those molecules predominantly are the cause for concern, but maybe certain amounts of those, or certainly what goes along with them, might be much more of a concern. One of the reports of this problem really spoke to potentially heavy metals being a problem inside of the devices. So hardware is definitely becoming much more prominent. It's very convenient. And you see a lot of different manufacturers for that. So I think a small subset of these cases may be driven potentially by heavy metal contaminants and heavy metal concerns. California regulations in January of 2019 required end product use testing for heavy metals. And what initially happened was there were a number of vape cartridges that failed, predominantly for the presence of lead, but there are heavy metals present in some of them. And I think it says, when did the manufacturers adapt, and what happened to all of the other vape carts that are no longer allowed through the cannabis regulated system? Were they pushed into the illicit, California market? Most likely. I don't think there were a whole bunch of, manufacturers that said, well, give me all those products back and I'll destroy them and rework them. There were a lot of people literally holding the bag saying, well, how do I sell this or move this in some fashion? And that may have caused a little bit of what we see. I don't think we can say how much, but there was a lab in Colorado that did some studies on finding cadmium being present in some of these pieces of hardware. And that might be some of the reasons some of these batches are bad. In California, I think we have a lot better comfort in the regulated system because you're looking for lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic inside of the cartridges once they are packaged, produced, and at the distributor. So the end product unit is being tested for those heavy metals before it comes out. And as I said, we saw initially a good number of them. There were some that were failing, but quickly the number that fail for that diminished, so quite rapidly. So I think the regulated system adapted and said, just like with pesticides, let's get those out of the supply chain. I didn't know this was a problem. I now know, but I'm not interested in providing products like that, and I'm not legally allowed to. So one great way to protect yourself might be to go to the regulated market and say, at least the products in California are tested in that fashion. Maryland's another place that does end product testing of that type. Not every state does it. So I don't know if we're going to be catching that in every single state, and that might be maybe more to be seen once we see the geography problems or how that comes to bear over the next few weeks or months with the CDC data. How that testing is being done is, it was a little tricky, I think, for the labs to figure out. I think they got a pretty good handle on it now. And I feel pretty good about the California system. When you're also concerning hardware, I think it's important to understand the temperature that these things may get to. So vape hardware typically goes from 100 degrees Celsius up to 315 degrees Celsius. As a chemist, we think that every 10 degrees in Celsius can double reaction rates or change the rate of change in molecules. So it's very important for us to consider at the much higher temperatures, you might start to see chemical transformations or changes that you would never see otherwise at lower temperatures. So that 200 degrees Celsius window is an enormous one in the world of chemistry. And I think some batteries are variable temperatures, some devices have been modified, and in the nicotine space, the hardware modifications to make bigger plumes of smoke and bigger, experiences of that type and bigger vapor streams, that's much more concerning from a chemist perspective, that are we causing chemical changes through that process that you wouldn't see if you're just testing the device at room temperature or the formulations that are going in them. So I think it is important to say, what hardware do I have? Is it quality made hardware? Has it been tested for metals? And then is this a variable temperature device? And if so, can I use it at the lowest possible effective setting? The lowest setting to elicit the desired physiological response would definitely be in the best interest of getting the actual molecules present in the formulation into the vapor stream, as opposed to, chemical transformations happening place while using the device. Also, you might be careful about how often am I pulling on it, because we can all feel them kind of warm up if you do too much, or if it goes around the circle, for example. Making sure they have a little time to cool and get back down to more ambient temperatures before their next use might also be an improved method of use in that regard. I think there's, interesting perspectives to be garnered since there are nicotine problems and cannabis ones. I thought I would talk about both because the topic was vaping. And I think the formulations used in the nicotine market are predominantly propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin based. A recent publication has come out that said only propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin in one of these devices. Those are the only two molecules in there in a 50-50 mixture. Over the course of a month of use, and it was consistent standardized use, they could see inflammatory markers rise, and they could see potential inflammations of some lungs in the users. So those molecules themselves may not be the best possible ones. And the state of Oregon banned those types of things in cannabis products. Colorado has now banned the use of MCT oil, polyethylene glycol, and vitamin E acetate as some of the types of diluents or additives that people are no longer permitted to use in the market in Colorado. Another major difference, though, I think, and maybe why we're seeing some of the younger users using a lot of these things, is the amount of nicotine. So in the UK, they have said you're only allowed to have 20 milligrams per mil as the top amount of nicotine concentration. There's no limits in the United States yet. And some of the devices, predominantly Juul, has been up to 60 milligrams per mil. So Juul uses a technology that is nicotine salts. It's actually more readily available for inhalation and more impactful via inhalation that way. And their concentrations are a lot higher. So you're now delivering a lot more nicotine to those users, which we know nicotine has a highly addictive potential. And I think one of the cases was a 28-year-old that had been purported to be using 20 to 30 vape cartridges a day. And when I hear that number, I'm like, that's not a cannabis user. They'd probably be asleep if that was them. So I think that's, obviously too much. That's a high use nicotine user. And they really find these obviously convenient. We're hearing stories of high schools having to take, measures to say you're not allowed to be juuling in the bathrooms. You're not allowed to be juuling on campus. I mean, those types of products are being used at much greater rates. And obviously they have much more nicotine in them, which might encourage that type of use. That's very concerning. And I think regulations could speak to changing that. That would make a huge impact in some of what we're seeing. Nicotine flavors are also predominantly for flavor. They don't flavor nicotine products for making a stronger effect per se. It's very different than what we use in cannabis formulations to try and drive physiological effects that are unique to the different cultivars, as opposed to this tastes more berry, this tastes more like peach, this tastes like cobbler. It's very different purposes for flavoring in the nicotine space. And because the base is more of a water-based one, propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, they use different molecules to make those flavors. One predominant molecule is diacetyl. It's been used to make artificial butter in microwave popcorn. And the manufacturers of those products were found to suffer from what's called popcorn lung. So large amounts of that molecule introduced to the lungs in the manufacturing process led these workers to have inflammation, and their lungs actually looked like they were little popcorns. And it was very, very harmful, very detrimental. And that molecule, along with another one very similar to it, is not allowed in Europe. We don't see that prohibition of that molecule yet in the United States. I think we certainly will now. But what we have seen is there's published data that says approximately 30 to 40% of the top 20 nicotine flavors still contain that molecule. That may be leading to some of these cases. If you've seen the news, it said this is chemical blistering or chemically based. It may be for those types of reasons, bad molecules causing those types of reactions. So it is important to say which molecules are causing the formulations and which ones might we consider banning or prohibiting, and certainly at which concentrations. And as I was saying, Colorado has said, let's not use any MCT, PEG, or vitamin E acetate, because we think vitamin E acetate is suspected at up to 50% of these cases have seen that in the ones of the samples that they've studied. And for those of you that may not be aware, lipid pneumonia is when fats pool in the lungs. So pneumonia is when I can't clear the fluid out of the lungs. It typically means water, and I'm literally drowning in that. Lipid pneumonia means fat-based pneumonia. So that would be things like MCT is a fatty type oil. We don't know if that could cause the problem. Vitamin E acetate is a much bigger molecule and may be implicated in these types of inflammations. That still remains to be seen and further studied to really say, yes, these concentrations of those are bad. But some states are saying, I don't want to take the risk now. We'll wait to see what the published research says later down the road. There's been a large number of brands that have been tested for vitamin E acetate. The labs quickly responded and said, let's test for vitamin E and vitamin E acetate. Let's see who may be using this. And a number of brands in California said, happily test my stuff. I know I've never used it. And sure enough, they came back with very clean results. So I think the reason for use of vitamin E acetate was a very interesting one. It's a visible detection reason. So everyone here may know that cannabis oils are highly viscous. They look more like honey. They're very thick. So high THC concentrations mean that your products are very thick, sticky, viscous oils. If I have added something to make them flow in a vape cartridge, it may be much more like water or much more thin and less viscous. So what happens in the illicit market is someone says, well, hand me your vape cart and let me flip it upside down and I'll see how fast the bubble moves from one end to the other. And that will give me a visual indication of viscosity. So if I'm interested in taking the limited THC oil that I have and making it go across a large number of vape carts, I might want to add something to, affect that change. If I add something that's thick or add a thickener, I'm going to pass the visible test of, is the bubble going fast or slow? It's going to move slowly. And I'm going to give this visual perception of high THC concentration. In a regulated market, I have to have it independently tested and slap a label on the product. So it says if it's 60, 70, 80% THC. That's very different than the illicit market that just says, what's it look like? So we also think that that's why the use of vitamin E acetate became much more prominent and has spread across the illicit market considerably, and why we're seeing more of these cases and problems from illicit markets than regulated ones. And I think it's good to note, and I'll note it again, that the California brands, we haven't seen, I think, any of them that have been using vitamin E acetate. There may be a very few that haven't tested, but predominantly that stuff is not going to be found in the California regulated system. But it's important when we think of terpenes and physiological effects that when lawmakers or regulators say, let's, eliminate flavors, what are they trying to eliminate? I don't think we want to throw out the compounds found in cannabis, the ones that are important for these physiological functions. While it may be okay to limit certain things from nicotine, I wouldn't want to necessarily do that for cannabis because I might lose effective physiological utility. And that unfortunately becomes a very difficult conversation, certainly one for the news it's very hard to have, and one with regulators and lawmakers that becomes more of a chemistry conversation that can be challenging too. Some of the bans have not done very well with which molecules they're going to permit or not permit in terms of flavoring. But I think that's a work in progress, and we know laws and regulations can change, and hopefully education will lead to much better types of flavor bans in that regard. And I think there's a perception of, cannabis molecules are all good. So if I got it all from cannabis, it must be fine. Cannabis derived should always be the only thing or the anything, and it should be okay. I think in general, we can say there's relatively low potential for harm in that fashion, but we don't know what happens through all these extraction processes. What we are pretty understanding of is they are not the same set of molecules that you had on the flower. And the graphic on the bottom is a flower example and a rosin pressed version of that exact same flower. So you can see pretty easily in just a simple picture form, I'm not getting the same terpene profile that I had on the flower through this extraction process. The same thing happens for live resin, for CO2 extractions. And when you talk about ethanol extraction, a lot more changes and a lot more goes away. So cannabis derived doesn't mean cannabis-like, if I would, saying flower-like in a way, or something that's really like what's on the plant. It can be very different in construct, and it might be very important to fully characterize and identify those things so that we understand, hey, did something form that could be an irritant to the lungs, even though it was never present in cannabis to begin with? It does happen that chemical transformations change the molecules throughout the extraction process, varying degrees and to different extents depending upon which extraction process you use. So I think, it's a good place to start, but we should start to characterize those products and understand, may they be the cause for any potential concerns or harms either. Botanically derived and synthetically derived, to me, especially as a chemist, a molecule is a molecule. Limonene is limonene, whether I got it from cannabis or I got it from orange peels. It's still limonene. I can go through and analyze it. It's still limonene. I can go through and physiologically ingest it. It's still limonene. So those things are good to put on a label. I think it's fair to say, hey, I've derived these things in this fashion. Was it cannabis derived? Was it other botanically or naturally derived? Or was it synthetically derived? But it doesn't mean I should say that limonene, from oranges isn't allowed, because it's still the same limonene. And there are ways that you could, clarify and classify those things properly and label them properly. And that's, again, the chemist conversation for lawmakers and regulators. I think it's also important to note that if I am taking cannabis and saying I want to use these terpenes from cannabis, I may get a very different pesticide profile than otherwise. And some states are saying test the cannabis oil and then go formulate the product and bring it to market. They may miss the pesticides. California's market doesn't do that. It tests for the end product. So you do understand, like if I have pesticides that I've introduced in some other way, whether it be hemp-derived botanical terpenes, that should be caught in the California market. But is it a concern that there are pesticides or other things causing some of the vape illness problems? Certainly in terms of the illicit market supply chains, that could be a very big problem. If someone has cannabis that fails and they backdoor it into the illicit market and said, go make vape pens out of that, we might have a part of the problem being from pesticides that are known to be irritating to the skin, certainly would be irritating to the lung and airways, and could be exacerbating some of the problems that we're seeing as well. I think from a user standpoint, what do I concern myself with? Like, where's the hardware coming from? Is it brand new? Is it something that my brand or my preferred product provider has been producing for quite a while? Have they been utilizing it? Can they tell me it's been tested? What do they know about where and how it's been manufactured? A lot of the hardware manufacturers, especially the responsible ones, are happy to stand behind their quality and say, look, we know we make quality devices, test away, we're fine, and independent labs can verify that. What other molecules are being put in there? I think certainly which additives are being added is a big concern. Am I using that to dilute them? It's predominantly those types of additives and a little bit of nicotine. In cannabis, it's a lot of cannabinoids, typically 50 to 70, 80% cannabinoids, and then some other terpenes or diluents that are used to standardize concentrations. So those two markets have different things, but which ones am I adding? Vitamin E acetate and other things may really be a cause for concern. I think ingredients, we definitely should understand labeling them and how to go about sharing them, that information with the consumers. I think the best way to do this, there's a model system that the TTB has set up for alcohol. If I'm a flavor house and I say, I'm going to put these things into a flavored vodka or a beer, for example, I tell the government all the exact molecules and their relative concentrations, but the formulation house that makes the actual alcohol product only knows from the government a code number that says this is okay to utilize, and I can put these in the products. And that protects trade secrets, encourages innovation and flavor development, and encourages the broadest possible use of those product categories. And I think a system like that would allow cannabis to keep flourishing, expanding, and finding the best possible physiological use while disclosing could there be cause for concern and helping lawmakers and regulators really restrict molecules that may be the major cause of concerns here. Everyone in California, I think, could probably feel a little better than some of the rest of the country because their quality control points are at the end product once it's packaged. And that, like I said, that's been different than some other states, but I think it's a very effective way of helping the consumer know my end product is what it was purported to be, it's what matches the label, and it's free of these types of molecules, pesticides, solvents, and other concerns. And then if they add certain molecules to watch for in terms of what's an additive or what's a flavoring component, then labs could also check for that and give great assurance to cannabis consumers in California and hopefully other states that those products contain what they say they are. I think ultimately, while we see some of the states quickly reacting to ban things and say what they do or don't want to see, we're now seeing the law come back and legal challenges saying that was illegal to ban the products, you don't have the right to do so. It's going to be a little bit, I'd say, choppy for quite some time. But ultimately, the FDA will have a major say in terms of federal regulations, especially for nicotine tobacco products, hemp and cannabis products it will have a say for. And I think eventually we'll see the states kind of mirroring more of that. There are other countries around the world like Canada and the UK and those in Europe that have really good regulations on their nicotine and tobacco products. And I think the US has kind of been modeling after some of that and will finally do so here soon. They've just been a little slower to act. But we can start to say, why aren't they seeing the problems? What have they said to not permit so far? And how might we be able to utilize that information to make good, effective regulations in the cannabis space quickly? While, it's federally illegal to have THC products, we still don't want to see people either A, waiting for the feds to say something in the regulatory scheme, or, have them be put in harm's way because they haven't been using good, effective products. I think we're actively a group that's trying to educate different states, lawmakers, regulators about those types of perspectives, what they should or shouldn't permit in a chemical sense. And I know there's a lot of other groups that are starting to say, hey, let's start to look at this. And there are more and more safety studies being done in inhalation now. I think there's grant money flowing. There's other active industry money saying, I want to study these things to really know what is good or bad in this regard. But we're going to see varying regulations. We may see local bans and challenges or not to those things, but only over time will we actually get, I think, a really solid set of regulations. We're seeing some, like I said, Colorado banned certain things. Washington and Oregon have said things. California's governor had said, let's not ban today, but let's start to go education. And then let's consider changing laws and regulations to make them more effective in terms of protecting the consumer. As a user, I think it's really important, how much am I inhaling? How much am I concerning myself with how much am I using in this fashion every day? What's the strength or concentration of my products? How many times am I inhaling? Am I starting to use more units in this fashion? When I do see that I've used a little bit more in a day, am I starting to feel differently? Our lungs are exceptionally sensitive. They're not really designed to take in much more than air. We've seen problems with particulates in air causing problems. We've seen problems with other molecules rising in air concentrations being problems. You're trying to deliver physiologically effective molecules through the lungs. It's important to watch what you're putting in there and how often you're going to be doing it. So as I mentioned, the one user that was consuming 20 to 30 vape cartridges a day, that's a lot, right? I don't think that anybody was designing these systems with that in mind. When they were first designed as nicotine cessation devices, it was you're smoking tobacco. Let's try and have you vaporize nicotine, and let's try and have you use less and less and less to completely eliminate the bad habit. This is not what we're seeing today. It's not educated that way. A cannabis user also isn't, medically using to try and say, I hope I get to stop using that fashion someday. That might be much longer cases or periods of inhalation use. And that's important to say, let's have a conversation with my doctor. Let's talk about what's in them. Let's understand my use. And if my rate's going up, am I feeling anything different? Or do I have any of the early warning signs for some sort of vape illness? Ask about your products as much as you can. What's inside them? How is it produced? How is it made? What can they tell you about it or not? And I think your general sense of awareness of, is someone really being forthcoming, or are they trying to hide something, can kind of come out through that. Know your vendors, know your products. And how long have they been doing this type of thing? How long have their formulations been around? Is this something brand new? Those are certainly types of considerations to try and understand when you're choosing a vape product. And I think, how consistent is every batch is another indicator. If you are saying, I've chosen brand X and I've used this consistently, but for some reason this one tastes off, ask yourself if you have a cold first, and that might be why things taste differently. But if not, let's see if they had a bad batch, if they tried some different formulation. Did they start trying to use cheaper ingredients? Did they make a change, and is that a cause for concern? I think those are all fair and good questions to ask as well.
Have answered all our questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity, and you guys have a good evening, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for coming out.